Good morning, everybody. Speaking as an ancient historian, I can tell you that in most pre-modern societies, of which we have accurate information, Kalev Leetaru would have most likely been burned at the stake as a wizard. He knows things that human beings shouldn't know, and he has mysterious ways of finding them out. His CV does not say that he attended Hogwarts, but then it wouldn't, would it? Instead, there's this fairly implausible story of being raised and educated by muggles in the soybean fields of central Illinois. Yeah, right. But he has now come to the bright lights, big city, and center of all power. I will not talk about Freemasonry, but I will say Washington, D.C., where he has been for some years at Georgetown University and now George Washington University as a senior fellow. He is one of our leading theoreticians, practitioners, and evangelists for big data, its power to transform society, to transform the way we think of ourselves and interact with the world. We are fortunate to have him here this morning, where he is going to speak about big data and its future in libraries and the future of libraries with big data. Kalev, welcome to Charleston. It's great to see you.
All right, let me get my timer going here. I have a habit of talking for long periods of time very quickly, so I always make certain to have my timer with me. Well, thank you so much. It's a true honor to be here with you all today. So most of my career really over the last 20 years has focused on how do we reimagine society through the massive amounts of data that we have with us. And I want to open with this project here. So this is a project I did several years ago. I approached the Internet Archive and said, you know, I want to reimagine the book. What if we thought of books not as containers of text, but as the world's greatest art gallery? And lots of people in the past have explored pulling images off of digitized books. But I wanted to see what would happen if we did that at scale. So in the end, took 600 million pages of books dating back 500 years, culled from over 1,000 libraries worldwide, and took the existing OCR that the Internet Archive had already done, and pulled off every image off of each page and all the text that surrounds that. And what we can do is really fascinating things. Find fascinating examples like this, which apparently came from I forgot the year. It was apparently a wedding. And we can find fascinating things like, to remember that, 100 years ago, mail by train, taking your letter and sticking it in a train going by was this incredible way of speeding delivery of messages compared, obviously to 100 years prior. But being able to walk through, 500 years worth of imagery, and the image at the top left there is a woodcut from 500 years ago. But the image to the right is a very famous one on, the telephone and communication, and it's really fascinating. One of my favorite books, 1921, it was an illustration of a teenager using a telephone, and the book said, in the future, we predict that teenagers will actually make use of the telephone heavily. So it's very funny to kind of see, and to really see it visually, to be able to see, how things are depicted in, famous illustrations through time, but also images like this. So these two images, these are from emblem books, and these come, the two books I think are about 100 or so, or maybe 200 years apart. One from a library here in the US and one from a library in Europe. Now historically, a historian would likely never have encountered both of these two images from these two books from these two libraries. It's unlikely that someone would have stumbled upon those two, but in the context of having all these digitized, machines can go through and identify similar images, and we can find these two images and say, you know what, the later artist probably copied this earlier one. This is too similar to be coincidence. So the power that data offers us to really understand imagery. And in this image here, starting in the back left, this is one image selected from each year. So this is 500 years of images. So the top left is the year 1500, one image selected. The next year is 1501, 1502, 1503, and on down. So you're seeing in one image 500 years of how imagery has evolved in books over time. And if you zoom into this, it's actually quite fascinating to see how styles have changed, to see the introduction of color, to see all these fascinating things like the scientific revolution go through there. So again, these really powerful ways of visualizing, understanding society. But then I want to come to this image. So what you're seeing, if you look in the lower left, you can see the year. And what this is I applied tools, algorithms that go through all the books published in a given year and pull out every location on Earth mentioned in those books in a given year. And so what you're seeing here, if you, so we're at 1870, 1880, 1890, watch, in a moment, you'll notice that the map's getting bigger and bigger and bigger, and then it just pops, it suddenly shrinks. Well, that's 1923, that's copyright resuming. And so this map's a very powerful map because it really demonstrates to us, how much copyright is impacting digitization and especially data mining and the conclusions that we can draw from all of this data. Because, we know so much between 1800 and 1922. I mean, all this incredible amount of data is available to us. But come 1923, when, so much of the digitization efforts have, basically end at that point, we basically, we lose, basically, we understand more of what happened 200 years ago than we do in the last 70 years. So this is just something to keep in mind as we think about, the world. But I also, that same theme I want to bring to this map here. So the map you're seeing at the top there is a map, is basically a grid of the world looking over the last 3 years, any location on Earth where there was basically a large number of tweets sent from during that period. So this is basically an animation by month over the last 3 years, from 2012 to end of 2014. And you'll notice Twitter expands over time, but then it kind of halts. It kind of freezes in time in the middle of 2013. And the bottom two graphs show you basically a scaled 1% sample showing the number of tweets per month and the number of unique users sending tweets per month. And now this is very important because, we think about, we oftentimes, today in our big data world, we grab for data. We say, wow, we're drowning in data, hundreds of or actually in this case, billions and billions and billions and billions of tweets. Look at all this data that shows a society. But to never lose track of the fact that, yes, we have these, these incredible volumes of data. But in the case of something like Twitter, that's only reflecting a really tiny portion of the world. And that view of the world has really frozen in time. And for folks like me that are data miners, this is really important because social media is not frozen. Social media is, just exploding across the world. I think Facebook announced, 1.78 billion users now, something like that. But that data isn't accessible to us. The majority of Facebook posts are private. The majority of social media as a whole is set to private. So Twitter was kind of the great public experiment. We had all this data to try and peer into society's soul, but to never lose track of the fact that, that never really let us look beyond, a very small portion of the world, and that view is really frozen. And I think this is something that we all too often lose track of is, who are we really hearing from? What are the views that we're really seeing across the world? And this was an example, just looking in that box there. Some of you may recall last year, Yemen, there's this big battle between Yemen and Saudi Arabia. And in Yemen, they fired a missile into Saudi Arabia. Well, that box there, that red box represents Yemen. And all the white dots here are anywhere that any tweets were sent during that period. And to see that, up north in that, Saudi Arabia, there's a lot of people tweeting there. In Yemen, not as much. So we're really missing half that story. So even as the stories that we can tell through data are becoming richer and richer, the comprehensiveness of that is shrinking. And I think that's a critical thing to think about. You think about, 20, maybe just 10 years ago, you might be looking at, say, a gigabyte of data out of a 10 gigabyte data set. Today, we're still looking at a gigabyte, but it's out of hundreds of terabytes of data. The tools that we use, the questions that we ask, haven't really scaled beyond what we were asking a decade ago. It always amazes me that, I think was it last year, was the 50th anniversary of the origins of dialogue. And it always strikes me that half a century later, we're still, the majority of the ways we interact with information is still through keyword searches. Half a century later, we're still searching through keywords. And that has always struck me of, that's not the natural way, to search information, to think about the world. And even when it comes to things like news, so this is an example. This is March of 2015, and this is looking at orange are all the locations mentioned in BBC News coverage. Green are all the locations mentioned in New York Times coverage. And for those of you that work closely with the social sciences, you'll know that there's a whole area of social sciences, political science, communications, and so on, where they hire a large team of humans to look through newspapers and write about what they're seeing there, try to catalog the world. But what we find, of course, is typically that involves looking at something like the New York Times, one single paper. And to really, data is very powerful because it allows us to really visualize and demonstrate that, the world is this incredibly rich place, and, no single source gives us a perfect view of society. And that's why, so what I really want to talk to you today is a project that I run called the GDELT project, which is an open data project supported by Alphabet Jigsaw, formerly Google Ideas, and a number of others. And this project is really about how do we catalog human society? How do we take all of that data that's out there today and try to understand what's happening around the world, specifically and in particular, so that we can try to bring the world closer together. You think about all the things, if you open up, say, the New York Times today or a paper here in Charleston, you're only seeing the smallest microcosm of society. How can we reach across the world and try to understand what's happening in the entire planet so we can tell the stories that aren't being told, that aren't being heard? So like any good project, this begins with data. So news media, over 100 worldwide news media, print, broadcast, and web, over 100 languages are processed. 65 of those are live translated. And in partnership with the Internet Archive, we send them a list every night of all the online media that we find around the world that they archive then into the Wayback Machine to preserve online journalism. And this is one of the largest initiatives in the world to preserve online non-Western journalism. Because, so much, take, for example, the coup in Turkey. Shortly thereafter, almost half the major media in Turkey disappeared overnight. So being able to really preserve that for perpetuity. Television, so this is another collaboration, we're looking at that. Academic literature, so this is a project, and this I think also really demonstrates the ability of data miners to collaborate with publishers. So this is a project, among others, JSTOR provided access to a lot of its holdings to be able to data mine and be able to look through academic literature and understand what have social scientists and humanists, ethnographers, linguists, and so on, what have they really written about the world over the last half century? What can we understand about that? How is the output of academia compared to, say, the output of the news media? How are these really combined? Books, of course, and then imagery, which I'll come back to in a second. Now, of course, as you look across the world, most of the world's media, most of the world's information is in a language other than English. So what you're seeing here is a dot at every location where GDELT monitored material from or about over about 6-month period of last year, color-coded by the primary language. Now, gray is English, and you'll notice there's not a lot of gray on this map. So if you're only looking at English language material, which is what most data mining does, and what most American scholars tend to focus on, you're missing most of the world here. Yes, there are people, there are plenty of news sources and other materials publishing in France that are published in English, but those don't reflect local views or local events, local things that are happening there. So just to always remember how important it is to look at information when you're trying to understand the world, you have to turn to all the world's languages, and in this case using machine translation. Now, machine translation is far from perfect, but it's good enough to tell us that, for example, I don't speak a word of Thai. So if I see a Thai language article, I can't tell you if this is, say, a local cricket match score, or if this is, say, an anti-government protest. So being able to leverage the technologies that we have today to really try to understand the world. Now you can imagine bringing in all this information from across the planet, and anything that's not in English, translating that in English. Now, what could you do with all that? Why would you want to do that? What's useful about all this? Well, two things. So the GDELT project looks at two things. It takes, one, it tries to understand the physical event. So what is this newspaper article telling me? Is this reporting on a riot, a protest, a coup, a peace appeal, a diplomatic exchange? So that's the event data set. But so much of what we're interested in around the world is not physical events, it's narratives, it's emotions, it's beliefs. And those of you that work at the humanities world know how important that is there. It's not enough to say, hey, a coup took place in Turkey. We all know that. What we care about is how are people reacting to that around the world? What are the emotions and the narrative beliefs? So what can we do with this? Well, from a physical event data set, if you take all the world, large fraction of the world's news media and you process that
and you make a list of every protest reported around the world over the last 40 years from that data set, you can take countries and you actually plot the intensity of protest activity and ask questions like when Greece was having its issues, what was that, a year ago? I saw this article, I think it was on CNN, that said, Greece undergoes worse violence in its modern history. And being able to look back and say, well, yeah, it was there was certainly some unrest, but nothing compared to 5 years ago, and certainly nothing compared to, times before that. So really being able to contextualize things, because again, we have such short memories, being able to really understand, the world around us, or being able to do automated alerts, to be able to say, hey, not many people are watching Burundi in December of last year, but to be able to say, hey, all of a sudden something's happening there that we need to pay attention to. So being able to put that in front of, say, peace builders, to be able to, again, people on the ground, obviously people in Burundi know what's happening there, but being able to tell that story to the world, because, something happens in Turkey, the world listens. Something happens elsewhere in the world, it's not making the front page of, say, the New York Times. So how do we tell these stories? How do we understand what's happening? And I won't go into this slide, but you can do things like actually look at the cycles of world history. We can actually build mathematical models over hundreds of millions of events that have taken place across the world, and actually find similarities there, cycles, patterns that repeat themselves, that allow us to really start peering into the soul of society. We can do things like map. Now, this is very old data, so that's why it's very sparse. This is, I think, from 3 years ago. But being able to actually map the world, actually watch the world go by moment by moment, to say, give me a map of all the protests happening right here on the world. What are the grievances? What are the things that are driving society? Is the world becoming more democratic or more autocratic around the world? Being able to ask these questions, to say, we've had things like news media and other data sets. These are not new things. We've had them for a very long time. But for the first time, we have the data to be able to ask questions of that. To be able to map things beyond, things like emotions, but go beyond positive, negative. So this is actually a map of anxiety. And this is the big trend line you're seeing, the big surge you're seeing there is the US government shutdown. And this becomes very powerful because, this was the case where there wasn't a lot of positive or negativity, because you had a lot of people saying, hey, great, I get a month vacation, fantastic. You had other people, saying, this is horrible, our government's shutting down, this is awful. So in terms of positive, negative, both sides, there were it's sort of like the election today, who's going to win the election? Well, depending on which candidate you're going for, it's a good or a bad thing. But anxiety is very high, because either side, you're worried about things. So being able to really ask deeper questions about society, be able to look at things like Ebola coverage. So this is a map, this is a timeline of coverage of Ebola in American television news. And you can see that, thousands of people are dying across the continent, no news coverage. Television is never mentioning it. Not till the two Americans get it that suddenly it's worth American media covering it. But that bottom graph is fascinating. That's how positive or negative the coverage is. And you'll notice after the Americans get it, media coverage becomes actually strangely positive about Ebola. And that's because the first coverage is very uplifting. CNN's first article about Ebola was very uplifting. It said, if Ebola makes our shores, we're all going to die. It's going to wipe us all out instantly. Very reassuring coverage. But once the Americans get it, it's like, don't worry, now that Americans have it, American medicine to the rescue. This will all be over soon and everyone will be cured. So being able to really capture that, and those that study journalism know these things happen, but being able to quantify this, to actually put that in a map. And of course, with the election right now, doing a lot of work, being able to actually count how many times each candidate is mentioned on television each day across the United States, and by market, across geographically different across the country, and what people are saying about the candidates. So being able to say, well, how are they contextualizing? Is Donald Trump, the savior of our nation, or is he the devil incarnate? Is Hillary a criminal, or is she, this incredible figure that's going to transform our nation? There's no right answer to these things. This all depends on who you are and where you are in this country. So being able to contextualize that, to peer inside of all that today, and this is, really fascinating to be able to see, just how polarized a nation has become. Being able to map things, the map in the upper right is very interesting. So that's a map of wildlife crime. So things like illegal fishing or poaching or so on. And what's fascinating about that is when I first went to make this map, I was told by a lot of folks in the community, don't bother trying to map what the media talks about wildlife crime. No one talks about it. You're not going to find anything. Because people, they're saying, well, the New York Times doesn't cover it, unless there's some huge ivory seizure. I don't really see much in the New York Times each day. Well, that's true. But local media in local communities do cover this every day. So always remember that, even if we don't see things in the information that we consume, to remember that global globally, there's so much information that's out there. And the dark map, the network diagram in the center, that was something that BBVA, the big bank in Spain, they want to see how is Russian media portraying the sanctions, the economic sanctions against Russia. So being able to say, well, how is the media within a country portraying something compared to what we're seeing out here? And in particular, I want to show this map. So this was something I want to know. I want to map global happiness. How happy or sad are people of the world? And this is a question that people have asked for an eternity. But I said, well, what if we take, so in this case, 200 million articles published last year in over, in 100 different languages, 1.3 billion mentions of location on Earth, and about 750 billion emotional assessments off of that. And so what I did is say, well, every article worldwide that mentions Paris, what's the average happiness or sadness of all of those mentions across the entire planet? And do that city by city across the world. And you end up with a fascinating map like this. And there's so many fascinating stories here. And you also start reflecting media. Certain countries' media reflects more of a negative tone towards things. But in particular in Europe, it's a little bit hard to see on the screen, but you see these really strong negative tendrils go through Europe, and that's a domestic reaction to the refugee crisis that's occurring there. So being able to see how domestic countries are reacting to world events, and just seeing that in a global stage is very powerful. And by the way, I should mention that was one line of code. So that was a tool that Google makes called BigQuery. It's a super database platform. One single line of SQL query, 60 seconds, 1 minute later, and you've processed that much data. So really we've moved to the ability where, when we have a question, we say, I wonder, or what if? The fact that we can actually answer those questions, or be able to peer into that media and say, well, who are all the people talking about a particular issue? Like CCS is a clean energy technology. Being able to look inside of that and say, well, what does this environment look like? What does this landscape look like? And this is something I want to conclude on. So this is a project, so Google, like many companies, is doing deep learning, neural networks, so artificial intelligence. They're doing some amazing work on having AI systems that can look at images and catalog what are the objects in that image? What are the activities in that image? Does this image depict violence? What are the logos, the locations? Can we look in the background of that image and look across the entire planet and say, can we estimate the location of this image? And that's very powerful because we can use this to do incredible things. So what you're seeing in the upper left, I asked it for all the images of trash around the world. And this is actually something I'm going to be putting out shortly, is actually looks across the world in real time and tries to estimate basically environmental conditions, so litter conditions, air pollution, and so on across the planet. But in particular, looking at things like flooding. So one of the things that we do is when a natural disaster like Hurricane Matthew passes through, being able to take all the imagery that's emerging from those areas and say, we don't want just presidents at podiums. We want to look at, we just want the images that show destruction so we can send those off to first responders so they know what's happening across these areas. So again, being able to move beyond text to really understanding the imagery of the world. And the fact that we have the tools today to look through, and so far we've processed 175 million images since this past January from every country on Earth in real time. So the ability to use tools to really try to understand the narratives of the world. And I want to conclude on this image. And this image really, by the way, this is a real image. This is not Photoshop. This is the NOAA Science on a Sphere. It's really cool. It's a 6-foot acrylic sphere hung from the ceiling with projectors around it. This is one of my data sets on it. And this really kind of summarizes what I think is so powerful about today, that we have so much data. We have the tools for the first time. We've always had more data than we can deal with, but we have the tools for the first time, the machines, the algorithms, et cetera, to make sense of that data, to let us peer into the soul society, and really understand it in ways that we've never been able to do before. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Kalev. This is challenging and exciting to think about in library context particularly. We have some time for Q&A before the next session. We have microphones down here at the front of the aisles where we can almost see from the stage. So please come forward with your thoughts, questions, provocations, suggestions, remonstrations, whatever they should be. Anthony.
I have a quick question. Kalev, it's wonderful. This is a library audience mainly. Give us your instructions about what librarians should do.
It's a great question.
You know, it's funny because in my own career, I've had a very adversarial relationship with libraries. Libraries have been sort of they have never gone out of their way to help me find data sets or connect me with publishers, connect me with what they hold, and help me kind of understand a lot of these issues. So, you know, I think libraries have a tremendous possibility to act as a point of contact on their campus. So I'm actually working with a number of publishers right now on cloud-based data mining. So how can publishers offer the ability for researchers on campuses, especially in the academic world, to be able to legally data mine those publishers' holdings, and a lot of that comes down to the role. You know, a lot of that comes down to the role that libraries will play in helping to sort of bridge those worlds. To say, well, you know, such and such publisher now has this data mining service. Who are the faculty on my campus that might find that of use, and how do I connect them? And I think with libraries, like with the Internet Archive, it's been amazing. You know, when I first approached them in 2013, I found a really welcoming arms in terms of all the data that they hold. I mean, again, they're one of the largest digital libraries, and just working with them, and every time I approach them and say, hey, you know, I've got this idea here, you know, being able to have them connect me with the right people within their organization, to be able to do those projects, to be able to explore the world through their data. And I haven't gotten that reaction with many other libraries. You know, Internet Archive has been a very unique library in that respect. And so I think a big thing is other libraries, you know, having that connection to say, you know, in some cases you don't hold the data, that, you know, you don't own that data, but you can connect people. You can say, hey, well, you know, how could we enable this? You know, how can we help our people try to understand the world? So I think a lot of it is playing facilitator, because most of the people like me, you know, again, I've been in this business long enough that, you know, I know most of the publishers, I know how to work with them, but most faculty don't. And so having, you know, that bridge to where someone can say, hey, I have this interesting project, you know, how would I go about contacting this publisher and getting permission to do this, or even knowing what libraries hold? I mean, you know, being at a number of having, you know, been in a number of institutions with large libraries, even knowing what the library held in its hands is a difficult task. So I think having that facilitation is a huge thing.
Ann Okerson, I have a simple question. How much resource does it take? How many people, how many computers, how much money? I mean, this feels so vast, and it feels like something that will go on for a lifetime.
Yeah, so it's a great question. And that's one of the beautiful things about the cloud today. So, you know, I lived in the National Science Foundation supported supercomputing world for about 15 years. So made use of a lot of the NSF supercomputers. And there, you know, there's computing grants that are available for that. So there, you know, faculty can, you know, if you're in an academic institution, you just go to NSF, you get a computing grant, and you're good to go. You know, again, now I'm more in the commercial cloud now, mostly because, again, the scale that I operate at simply surpasses what's out there. But again, you know, a lot of the work that I do is truly at this massive scale. But, you know, there's so much work that goes every day that you can do on a laptop. And I think that perhaps is one of the greatest transformations here, is the fact that you don't need a supercomputer to do, you know, to do most of the work that's out there. You know, a simple laptop and the ability that, you know, even a small machine now, we have the tools, we have the capacity. I mean, you know, heck, buying a laptop with a couple terabytes on it, I mean, you go down to the Best Buy and, you know, buy it for, you know, dirt cheap. I mean, that astounds someone who, you know, used to scrape to buy to get a few hundred megabytes of storage. So I think you know, that's a fascinating part, but that's also why I put a lot of those projects in the beginning, the Twitter analysis and that copyright map, because that is also a challenge that people today, they don't have to be specialists. They can just go out, get data, analyze it, and publish papers without understanding the nuances of their data. And I think that's another role that libraries can play, is to help researchers understand the nuances of their data, because most people aren't familiar with working with data. Libraries, you know, you guys are familiar with understanding collections and you know, collection management, these types of things. So helping, you know, people be able to recognize those things.
I have an odd question. If you had 50,000 documents that you'd already thoroughly analyzed, and you came across 30,000 new ones that you don't know what they were related to, how long would it take you to dedupe them and find out if there was anything new?
I think this is interesting, though, the possibility. So I actually worked with a professor named Matthew Connolly at Columbia University, and this was declassified State Department cables from the Kissinger era. And what was so fascinating about that is, you know, this is a collection that's been around for a while, and a lot of diplomatic historians had dealt with. But what's so powerful is the ability that one of the visualizations that we did that got a lot of attention is we looked at from every cable sent from, so again, this is all declassified that the State Department has released to better understand the Kissinger era. What was so fascinating is that we're able to say, for example, the embassy in Cairo, what were all the other embassies that it was sending traffic to and from? And what were the patterns of communication that spread around the world? What were the countries that were being mentioned in those cables? And the ability today of tools to allow us to visualize, and even historians to be able to understand things in new light. So I think that, again, obviously there's, kind of the notion of, having a document collection saying, is anything new here? Is there anything interesting here from criminal prosecution or other things? But I think that these same tools have immense applications. And I think that's actually what's so fascinating to someone like me, is so many of the tools that exist for us to use today come from so many different disciplines. I mean, on a daily basis, I use tools from chemistry, physics, astrophysics, astronomy, linguistics, so many different disciplines. And that I think is also what's so exciting, is that you've got commercial companies, you've got academics, you've got all these people producing this massive wealth of tools that we can use to ask so many questions that aren't even the ones that these tools were designed for. And I think that's a really exciting part, is the fact that yes, disciplinary boundaries are still there. Chemists don't usually talk to, say, linguists. But, we are starting to have, especially in the data world, because the programmers, a lot of times it's programmers, that are working in these groups to produce these tools, and those programmers talk to each other and they communicate. So the fact that our world is becoming smaller. But I think there's also challenges in that. I mean, I know in my own papers, every day when I see those Google Scholar citations come in of someone who cited one of my papers, and they cite, according to Leetaru et al., in one of my papers, say from 2012, or my Twitter papers, and they say, according to him, 99% of all tweets have GPS coordinates. And I say, where on earth did you get that number? Where are these things coming from? So I know even from my own work, I think things like Google Scholar have been amazing to allow you to surface publications outside of your area, but it's also incredibly dangerous because people aren't reading the papers anymore. They're just going to Google Scholar saying, I need a quick citation for something. They take the first link, stick it in the paper, they look at a little snippet, quote it, or maybe they read a sentence, or they don't read it at all. And I think that's also kind of an interesting thing of just how much that's transforming the scholarly landscape. And just one other note, I talked to a major scientific publisher, the editor-in-chief recently, and he said, in the past we only permitted citations in research papers that went to major journals. Today we accept citations, sole citations, to personal blogs now. So someone can, and this is a very major journal, so, I mean, it's a mover and shaker, and to say that, you can make a claim in a paper now and cite a personal blog as your sole source. I mean, that's a really fascinating landscape that we're shifting into in terms of scientific knowledge, in terms of how that world is evolving.
So one more question from here on the left.
Hi. So speaking of the casual observer you just mentioned, how would you interpret at a glance, for instance, your happiness chart? What color means what?
Yeah, so this is a really fascinating thing, and this is why so much of analysis, I think this is also a danger, because so many people today are grabbing data sets, they're grabbing tools, they make that map, and they say, hey, I got a map, and they put it out there without really understanding the nuance of it. The happiness map was actually really fascinating, because as you drilled into it, you saw things like in America, for example, you saw a lot of conflict, a lot of negativity. It was really fascinating because what you saw, for example, really short aside, here in the US, when, for example, let's say there's some gun violence, the newspapers tend to sensationalize it. They really glamorize it like a James Bond novel, and the police respond, in armored personnel carriers and, with weaponry and everything. In the UK, where, handguns and gun violence is much more rare, the press doesn't sensationalize it as much. You might say the armed response unit was sent out to detain an individual with a firearm. He was arrested and all as well. And that's reflected in the data, because you see that the media in the US, really reflects this violent society that's, guns blazing, Wild West all across the nation. And you don't see that in a lot of other countries. And it's not reflecting that, murder rates here are actually lower than a number of nations. What it's reflecting is how that's captured in the data that we have. And that tells us something as a society of why does media reflect that? You see in some countries that the media tend to focus on the negatives of societies, that positive news almost never gets covered. In other countries, you see positive news tends to outweigh negative news. And it's not because everything's wonderful there, nothing ever goes wrong, it's that these are conscious decisions. So it really also, I think, helps us understand the biases in media. It helps us really understand what are we understanding about the world. Most of us haven't been to Syria recently. What we see about Syria comes from the media. And so really understand how is that narrative being shaped? How is that changing over time? And so a lot of it is creating maps like this and going back to disciplinary scholars, going back to say, communication scholars, or journalist scholars and saying, what can we understand about how journalism functions from this? Going out to political scientists and saying, well, what can we understand about national conflicts, and especially how that underpinning affects how we understand conflict. And again, in this hypersaturated world, we don't make decisions based on fact. We make decisions based on our emotional interpretation of available information. And so, if all we see is this negative coverage about something, that can really have an impact and shape us. So I think a lot of it, I think kind of the short answer to that is, the visualization or the analysis, that's never the end point. That's a starting point to go to work with those scholars and really bring folks together to reimagine the world through all this data that we have. Thank you so much.
Kalev, I hear Time's winged chariot behind us, so I think we'd better clear the stage. But thank you. This was.
Thank you so much. It was an honor to be here.